Hello, hello. Great. Hello, everyone. I'm Casey Schwartz. I'm so excited to be on stage with Kanishk Tharoor to talk about his new, beautiful debut collection of short stories, Swimmer Among the Stars. Kanishk, because this is your first book, I think it's only right I begin by embarrassing you slightly and reading out what some of these remarkable reviews have said so far. India Today says you are refreshingly profound. You are on the cusp of reinventing storytelling. In the Telegraph, you're compared to Kafka, and elsewhere to Borges. So tell us, where and how did this book start?
Well, I mean, those reviews are incredibly generous, and I've been really surprised and grateful for the really good response I've got from the book so far. It's funny because these stories, in many ways, to me, feel like little objects that have just accumulated almost by accident over the last 10 years. I'm writing a novel right now, so it's not as if I was just dedicated to writing a book of short stories, but in the process of developing myself as a writer, I had been writing short stories for a long time, and the ones in the collection, the oldest one was written when I was about 19, but the bulk I've written in the last 5 years or so, and they've sort of accumulated almost helplessly by themselves to the point that I think I was able to put them into a collection.
Well, the collection, it's interesting you would say that. The collection has such a global sensibility and a sense of being so at home anywhere in the world rather than rooted in a particular place. There's a story that takes place in outer space. There's a story that takes place in Morocco. Where did that kind of confidence, that ease in the larger world come from, do you think?
It's true. One of the things I wanted to achieve with this collection of short stories is that so far the collection is only available in English, but that any English-speaking reader, no matter where they are in the world, might be able to try to access them in the same way, that they would simultaneously be estranged and yet be able to relate to the story at the same time, that my stories don't necessarily privilege anybody from any particular country, any particular region. I guess I am trying to engender a slightly global kind of storytelling. And it comes a little bit from I guess my own biography, though I don't think I'm writing about myself. I grew up in an international milieu. My father worked for the United Nations. I went to international school. I've had the fortune to have lived and studied and worked in a few places around the world. And all of that has helped, I think, produce the atmosphere that is in these stories, which is slightly decentered, not rooted in a specific place, but trying to conjure a kind of, let's say, omniscient third-person storytelling voice that's slightly pre-modern, actually, I think, or I hope, that's flecked with the firelight of older kinds of storytelling. And that voice isn't necessarily the product of a single place.
So on that note, maybe you'd like to read from the opening story.
Sure. I'll read the beginning of the first story in the collection, which is called Elephant at Sea. And I'll just tell you a little bit about it to begin with. It comes out of a story that was told to me a lot when I was a child by a family friend who was in the Indian Foreign Service about a Moroccan princess who had asked the Indian ambassador in Morocco for an elephant. And then the request was sent through to Delhi, and eventually, many years later, as these requests, the speed of these requests as they're processed, the elephant was sent on its way to Morocco at a point when the princess had completely lost interest in the elephant in the first place. And amazingly, I'll just tell you this now, when I wrote this story, it was a sort of flight of fancy. It was something that came out of my imagination. But I did a book launch in Delhi a few days ago, and in the audience was the daughter of the Indian ambassador who had to deal with this request. And she was friends with the Moroccan princess. She had seen the elephant when it arrived. And this story, which I had imagined as a completely imaginative, almost surreal episode, for her had real meaning. And it was my first experience of letting something come out of my imagination and then find it return to me in the real world. And similarly, in the same audience, there was a man from the Cochin Port Trust who told me that in the museum attached to his port, the most popular exhibit is images of this elephant being hefted up onto a ship to be sent to Morocco. So again, this was a kind of small surprise and revelation that something that could come out of my imagination was also returning to me in reality. So I'll read from the beginning of this story. In the late summer of 1979, the second secretary of the Indian Embassy to Morocco received a cable that undid his considerable years of training and left him floundering. The message read simply, "Elephant en route." Was it some sort of code? Further investigation only deepened his confusion. The cable had come from the customs office in Cochin, a port in the south of India. No, the customs officials reported back to him, it wasn't code. It was an elephant that along with its mahout was now very much headed by ship to Casablanca. The second secretary probed, why send an elephant? Here at the customs office, the reply came, we handle only the movement of goods. For the movement of reasons, please refer your inquiry to Ministry of External Affairs. The second secretary telegrammed his colleagues in the ministry in Delhi. With telegrams to the ministry, it was important first to be terse, so that in the midst of reams of communication from outposts around the world, your message would be noticed. Why ship elephants? Stop. Embassy already has cars. Stop. No one in the ministry seemed to know anything about the elephant. A flummoxed telegram returned to the embassy. What elephant? Stop. Is this code? Stop. Embarrassed, the second secretary finally consulted the ambassador, who knew through long experience that it was pointless to question the whims of the capital. Marvelous, the ambassador said, smoothing his mustache. An elephant, just what we need. And they couldn't even send it to us. No, they're sending it to Casablanca. You have to arrange for the thing to be picked up, to be met and picked up. He sprayed himself with cologne and mused, if an elephant can even be picked up. That night, the second secretary lay awake in bed, resenting the sheets, resenting the pillow, resenting the indifference of his work, resenting Morocco, resenting Arabic for its impossible secret throatiness, and resenting with what little bitterness was left to him the unknown buffoon who would make diplomacy out of elephants. The buffoon was not, as he imagined, some self-satisfied civil servant in South Block, but the Princess of Morocco. Explanation arrived via telex from a friend in the ministry who owed him a few favors and so mustered the initiative to ask around. The story of the elephant had begun 6 years earlier in the same Indian embassy in Rabat. At one of those habitual functions whose purpose seems so obvious in the preparation but disappears in the operation, the little Moroccan princess had come to the embassy and frozen before a picture of an elephant. It was among the many stock images, all approved by the Ministry of Tourism, that lined the lobby of the embassy. Dawn over the Himalayan ranges, houseboats on the backwaters, the Taj Mahal rosy in its cushion of smog, a bright tractor devastating a field of wheat. The princess only had eyes for the elephant. Her wordless arm extended towards the picture, pointing. C'est un éléphant, said the embassy official tasked with escorting the princess. She remained transfixed. Vous aimez les éléphants? The unlucky man suggested. It seemed the princess did love elephants because she wouldn't move. The official, who had in previous posts offered counsel on trade policy with Indonesia and arms deals with the Soviet Union, looked around for help before lowering himself to her level. Mademoiselle, vous voulez un éléphant? He asked, with the desperation stoked in him by all children, never mind the Princess of Morocco. She turned, smiled, and gave him the smallest gift of a nod. It was enough. The official eventually spoke to the then ambassador, who put in the request to Delhi, recommending the delivery of an elephant to satisfy the princess and to strengthen a bilateral friendship. The request passed through the appropriate channels at the usual speeds. 6 years later, the creature was irrevocably on its way. I'll just stop there for now. But that story perhaps, and it's one of the more playful stories in the collection. It gives you a sense of of some of the tone that I try to engender in all my fiction. From the third person to the slightly broad-lensed view of places and people, and I think it's something that exists across the collection.
And when did you begin to develop that style?
I think it's something I've particularly developed in the last 5 years, while at a time when I've been more devoted to fiction. I sort of made the choice consciously to improve my writing and to work on my writing in the last 5 years in a decisive way. But I've always been writing for a long time. I grew up in a house full of books. My mother is a professor of literature. My father, as many of you know, is also a writer. I had the fortune that the world of writing and reading never seemed like an opaque, unattainable place. It was something that was very much part of my day-to-day life, even as a young person. I think my first story that I think we can still find a copy of was written when I was 6, and it was called something like Sir Kanishk and the Magic Lamp. And you can probably imagine what the plot of that was like. But I've been writing for a long time, and I think these stories, even though many of them they've been written mostly in the last 10 years, they follow on from a long engagement with stories, with storytelling, and with the act of writing.
It must have been so rich to grow up in a household like that. And I'm curious, is there anything complicated about being a writer who is the son of a writer?
I don't know if I'd say it's complicated. It's incumbent upon me. This is my first book. I've been very grateful for the reception it's received so far. But I know that, especially in India, my father is a very well-known person, and it's incumbent upon me and my work to rise to the point where I'll have slightly greater degree of independence in the way my work is received. But I wouldn't say it's complicated. If anything, having my father and my mother, who's also a reader and a writer, has been a great source of help and inspiration. They're my first line of readers, along with my twin brother, who's also a writer. He's a journalist, and my wife, who is also a writer. She's a poet. They read my work first, and so for me, they've always been a source of inspiration, of help. And not really a source of resistance.
And to go back to for a moment, you said your childhood was sort of far flung. Where did you grow up mostly?
Well, I say far flung. To be fair, my father was working for the UN, so my brother and I were born in Singapore at a time. He was working for refugees in Singapore. We grew up in Geneva, and then we lived for most of our lives since the age of about 6 in New York City. And that's the city that's my home. It's where I live now. It's where my mother is. It's where my friends are. And it's also the city that, in and of itself, being so international, I think has really helped shape my outlook. There's another story in the collection which is the title story, which is called Swimmer Among the Stars, and that is about language extinction. And though it's not set in New York City, it's very much inspired by the city. I've always been really attuned to the diversity of the city, and one of the things that struck me recently is that New York is a place where it's a repository for dying languages. There are languages spoken in New York that are no longer spoken in their countries of origin, Indonesia, Kenya, Bangladesh, and so forth, but still survive in diasporic communities in the city. And I've been engaged with that a little bit in the last few years, and so I decided to write this story about the diminishing of language diversity in our world. And the story itself is an interview between a group of ethnographers, and a woman who is thought to be the last speaker of her language.
Kanishk, do you want to read from it?
I think I'll read a little bit from that story. If I can find it. Okay. So this is from the title story, Swimmer Among the Stars. As a rule, the last speaker of a language no longer uses it. Ethnographers show up at the door with digital recorders, ready to archive every declension, each instance of the genitive, the idiosyncratic function of verbal suffixes. But this display hardly counts as normal speech. It simply confirms reality to the last speaker, that the old world of her mind is cut adrift from humans and can only be pulped into a computer. She finds it strange to listen to the sounds of her mouth. Inevitably, she mingles a more common language with her own. That common language, after all, is the speech that now keeps her company, that leads her through the market, that sits with her in the evenings by the television, that gives her the terminal diagnosis at the clinic, that pours through her letterbox, that comes in a crisp nurse's outfit to wash her feet. Her own language does nothing of the sort. It is nowhere to be found. She pauses, silent now, staring incredulously at the microphone. How am I the last speaker of my language? How can I be its keeper? My language left me. She apologizes to the ethnographers. You must understand, she says, that though my memory is preserved better than a lemon, it is still difficult to remember which words are my own and which words are not. Please speak as it comes naturally to you, the ethnographers say. Thank you, I will try. In any case, we can help you remember. The last speaker looks up, puzzled. But if you know already, then why do you want to hear it from me? It means something more if it comes from you. Do you speak my language then? Do you understand me when I say this, when I say that? And even now when I am singing this song that my father sang every day as he disappeared down the valley? She sings and her alien words crackle about the room. No, we do not understand, the ethnographers say, or if we do, it is only distantly. Oh, that is a shame. It would be nice to sing that song for someone. Please, madam, sing it for the microphone. She grins. So the microphone understands, does it? Yes, it understands. If only you could get microphones to talk. She laughs and then feels a little sorry for herself. She does not mean to sound sardonic. No one could accuse her of being indifferent to her plight. Some years before, it had occurred to her that she was no longer in the habit of hearing her own tongue. Everybody in the town seemed to be speaking the common language. She did not mind using their language, since she had dwelt in it for a long time, almost as long as she could remember, and had kept it clean and given it a good airing, rearranged the furniture so it suited her just right. It was the language of her husband and her children, and she had made it hers. But always, in the darker corners, she placed mementos of her own, a proverb, a snatch of a rhyme, some light daily expressions, the glimpse of which would startle her family. With nobody to speak her language to, she began talking with objects, the pots and pans, a creaking door, the sharp corner of a table. She never spoke it with animals because, and here a foreign kind of pride sparked within her, it was never a language to waste on goats. Once, on a rare visit, her son came upon her in the living room, speaking in tongues with a teacup. He told her she was going mad. No, she sighed, you don't understand. This is what a conversation sounds like. Would you like a cup of tea? The last speaker asked the ethnographers. They would. Let's have some tea then, and then I'll sing for you. She rises from her seat and waits as they shift their equipment, their light stand and camera, the microphones, the attendant knots of wires. Brushing away their offers to assist her, she lights the stove with a match and stares out through the kitchen window. Poplars nod in the breeze over the mustard field. Someone's boy is loitering at the front gate, his hands in the pockets of his jeans. At each half step, his sneakers light up red. She thinks he must be here to look at the visitors, but she is wrong. He follows her movements with open and unblinking curiosity, as if there was something surprising about the way a kettle boils. She smiles. That's the matter with strange guests. They turn you into a stranger as well. The tea warms her voice. When she sings, her eyes close and her chin, with its gentle down of hair, thrusts forward into the lamplight. The ethnographers cannot help but admire her strong set of teeth, a rare sight in so much of their fieldwork. They are used to thinking that there is half a relationship between dental health and endangered languages. Languages, like people, become toothless. In her case, of course, a full mouth of teeth won't make any difference. She is the last, the very last. After her, the language has only a ghostly future. Its memory will haunt scholars and graduate students. Nobody misses it in the places where it was once spoken. Few even remember the time when its clambering rhythms united the valley and the uplands. Clinically speaking, it is already dead. A language cannot be alive if it exists alone in the mind of an old woman, no matter how fine her teeth. I'll stop there for now. Thank you. But it's just, one of the reasons this story is important to me is because I recognize very much that I write in English. I am part of the hegemony of English. And so I think it's for all of us who are readers and writers in English, it's important to recognize that we are part of a language system that is in part responsible for the diminishing of the diversity of languages around the world.
And how did you decide to make that the title story, Kanishk?
I have to confess that those kinds of decisions were very elegantly suggested to me by my publisher, and I was happy to accede to their suggestions. I tend to write very lyrical stories, and as a result, I try to sometimes, maybe misjudging what I should do, give them slightly more prosaic titles. And I think in this case, my original title was overruled by the publisher, and they've come up with this quite evocative title that I think actually captures the spirit of the book very well. One of the things I hope to achieve with these stories, and as a reader, one of the things I enjoy as a reader is finding in fiction a kind of sense of wonder, a wonder that's not necessarily directed at the excellence of the prose or even the way the story moves, but a wonder that lifts off the page and opens up to the world outside. And I hope that's also what these stories achieve for readers.
Mm-hmm. Huh. And it's interesting that all the stories are marked by this very distinctive, almost sort of fabulous, like sort of slightly magical realist style, except one, which seems to be sort of an autobiographical story about a young man at a college in Connecticut, struggling to get over his aversion to his roommates. So, and it's such a departure from the book style. What was the thinking about including it there?
There is one story in the collection that sticks out slightly as a sore thumb. It is, though, I wouldn't necessarily call it autobiographical. It's not really about me. But it was an attempt to write a different kind of story. You're right, it's the only story in the book that's first person, and it is very much set in the modern day. A lot of the other stories either take place in the future or in the past or in a kind of mythical time space. I just wanted to show that there was a register I could write in that wasn't just the one that the majority of these stories are in. But I think, even there's some of the language and some of the style is still shared across the stories, even though the subject matter is slightly different.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yes, absolutely. And I hope we have time to talk about your story that takes place in space, the United Nations being forced to meet on a spaceship. What is the inspiration behind that story?
Well, so there's a story in the collection called A United Nations in Space, and it dramatizes a sort of future world that's riven by climate change and war, at which point the United Nations can no longer meet in New York City, which is flooded in any case, and so is driven into a sort of orbital hotel in outer space. And this was actually, the inspiration for this story actually came out of a real life event, which was a few years ago. The Parliament of Libya, because of chaos in that country, had to meet on an enormous, luxurious Greek ferry that was parked in the Mediterranean. And a lot of my stories I find I dwell in the imagination, but my imagination is sparked by things that happen in the real world, in pieces that I've read in newspapers, in my interest in history and sort of lesser known periods of history. And this story likewise came out of reading I'd done and a news story that triggered something in me, and I found that quite amazing. This parliament that is governing a country outside of the country, and completely cut off from that country in this kind of ludicrous vessel. And so I took that to its logical extreme, which would be the United Nations in outer space, and a short story followed suit from that.
Is there anything you might want to say to the young writers and readers who are surely in this audience? Any inspiration about becoming a writer?
Well, I like to think that I'm fairly young myself still, so it's a little bit churlish of me to foist advice upon people, aspiring writers. But I really think, at a time when I decided that I wanted to devote myself to my craft, I think one of the things that helped me was that I trained myself to be a slightly more critical reader. And that's something that doesn't necessarily come naturally to me. I think I'm an attentive reader, but I read for pleasure. And sometimes when you read for pleasure, you're not necessarily noticing the sort of nuts and bolts things that make writing pleasurable or reading pleasurable. And so I think the first step for me in recent years has been making myself a better reader, and then obviously reading copiously. I think a lot of people struggle also with finding it possible to juggle a full-time job and other responsibilities and writing. And I think it's perfectly possible to have a full-time job and be a writer as well. I don't think writers have to be people. In fact, it's probably better if writers aren't people who are simply writing all the time. I think it's good to have other kinds of experiences that help shadow and shape the writing you do. But I think what is important, though, is making writing a routine and flexing that muscle. Again, this is something that I struggle to do myself. It can be difficult with our erratic schedules and responsibilities to always find the time to do the writing you want to do. But I try to sort of do a little bit of writing every day just to keep that muscle active. Mm-hmm. And I think just more generally and beyond all those kinds of logistical things is to trust, if you're interested in writing, to trust yourself and to trust the kinds of stories you want to tell and trust your instincts and not necessarily write what you expect other people to want you to write. I think it's really important to write what you want to write because that's what I do. I don't really subscribe. Especially as an Indian writer living in the West, there are certain kinds of expectations about the kind of writing that you might produce. And I've never felt beholden to them, in part because those are kinds of narratives that haven't particularly, are of interest to me, but don't particularly represent my interests or my experience of the world. And so I've always just trusted my imagination and trusted where it's led me, and this collection is a manifestation of that.
Mm-hmm. What are you working on now?
I'm working on a novel that's I've been working on for a few years, and it's very different, obviously, than writing a collection of short stories. With short stories, you get this sort of routine sense of accomplishment after finishing one. With a novel, you're in this kind of dark tunnel with only a speck of light in the distance. So I'm hoping at least that speck of light is going to grow a little bit wider in the coming months. But I'm also, I'm a journalist as well, and I freelance on the side, and I'm also working on a radio series. I'm interested in, as readers will see, I have a lot of historical interests, and I'm working on a radio series for BBC that's going to air at the end of February, which is about cultural destruction in Iraq and Syria. And it's a 10-part series, and each episode tells a story through personal narratives and other kinds of stories of a different object or site that has been destroyed and damaged in the last 20, 30 years in Iraq and Syria. So it's a slightly mournful, elegiac series, but I hope it's of interest to listeners around the world.
I'm sure the audience has questions. Shall we?
Yes, from the little I've heard from your reading, you seem to be based in realism. I'm from North America, and they're into zombies and vampires with great obsession. I just wonder if you'd use that to say a few words. Would you think about that genre? Would you apply that genre yourself? And how that might relate more to a realistic style that you yourself might use? Thank you.
You know, as much as I might from time to time enjoy watching a zombie or vampire-related film, I don't necessarily do a lot of reading in that genre. I always have, since I was quite young, had a love for fantasy and its sort of imaginative realm. And I'm sure in many respects some of the breadth of these stories is reflected in that interest in fantasy. But you know, there are other sorts of influences and kinds of writing of equal imaginative breadth that I think have influenced me, and those did come out of slightly more modernist, often Southern European styles of writing, potentially, though I don't want to, you know, I'm not associating myself with these august writers, but the likes of Italo Calvino and the South American writers, Eduardo Galeano and Borges and so forth, have really influenced my work. And so in many respects, even though I have grown up in New York City for much of my life, I feel that the frame of reference that my writing exists in is not necessarily a North American one, but one that has opened to include influences from Asia, from Indian writing, to South American writing, and also, to be very honest, I do a lot of reading of pre-modern material. I think I read as much medieval Persian poetry or ancient epic or 19th century folklore as I read contemporary fiction.
So I just want to enhance on this question. Just as he asked, in North America these days, or most part of the world these days, people are more focused on writing something mainstream. For example, the Twilight series, or you can talk about the Game of Thrones series, even though Game of Thrones is not mainstream. But I have the question that should a writer write for the audience, for example, main audience of millions of people who love the dramas and love stories like Twilight and other stories, or should he or she write for himself or herself? For example, for myself, I prefer science fiction and philosophy stories. The last good book I read was Oath of Vaiputras by Amish Tripathi, and I also love this short stories that come in fantasy and science fiction. So my question to you is, should a writer write to cater to the audience of millions of people, or should he or she express himself and write for himself? Because at the end of the day, a writer is a reader for himself. The first reader of a writer is himself, right?
That's a great question. Instinctively I would say to you that you should write for yourself, though obviously as a writer, you have, when you're sitting down to write these stories, you may be thinking about the language you're using, the story you're building, the characters you're developing, and so forth. But you obviously, on the back of your mind, you're thinking, who's going to read this thing that I'm putting down on the page? So, you know, for me, I'm not necessarily aspiring to the great and wonderful mass appeal of a system of a story system like Twilight, or even those of Amish Tripathi. But you know, I'm an optimist. I really think that there's space in the world of literature for all kinds and all sorts of genres of writing. I'm not necessarily reaching for that kind of success as you describe, but I am following through with my own instincts and the world I imagine. I'm staying true to those, and my hope is that, you know, when I imagine my reader, I'm imagining somebody who is curious about the world beyond themselves, is curious about history, is curious about the ways, you know, surrealist narratives can work. And my hope is that there are many readers like that. And I hope that, you know, as I said before, that these stories can add a little bit more to, you know, make a modest contribution to the extent of wonder there is in the world.